Not like this we did. Not like this we did. Not like this we did. Oh, not like this we did. 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 Oh, not like this we did. 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 Oh, not like this we did.
Greetings, curious cats, and welcome to Curiosity Feeds the Cat. Now, as part of our journey of inquiry, we are going to be subjecting some of the extraordinary claims made by the world religions to serious scrutiny. Obviously, I used to be a Christian, so I'm primarily going to be dealing, for most of the time, with the claims of Christianity. One of the most troubling ideas in Christianity is the idea of original sin. And I still remember reading this as a 15-year-old and thinking, it makes no sense. There is absolutely no way I can reconcile this with the idea of a benevolent, wise, kind God. But more pertinently, what I found quite curious was language, or the language of original sin, if you like. What were they speaking? What language were they speaking? Now, the claim is this, that the first two people were put in a garden and God had a conversation with them. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, was it telepathy or was God speaking to them in a language? And if he was speaking to them in a language, which language was he speaking to them in? What I found even more puzzling was the idea that they had communication with each other, and they also had communication with a talking snake. Now, where am I going with this? Here's my question. How do the first two people, who we are led to believe ever existed, manage to communicate with each other? How did they manage to communicate with a snake? What language did they speak? We all know from experience that human beings learn to talk by imitating their parents. Babies basically learn to talk by mimicking what their parents are saying. So a language had to pre-exist. How did Adam and Eve learn to talk? We would have to assume that they had to teach themselves how to talk. They then had to invent the first language all by themselves. And then they had to teach this language to the talking snake in order for them to have some kind of communication. Now, where am I going with this? Is it reasonable to believe that this is actually what happened? That they taught each other how to talk? They then invented the first language? We know pretty much that Hebrew or Aramaic or any language from the ancient Near East wasn't the first language in the world. Not even close. But we have to assume that if this story was true, they taught themselves how to speak. They also invented the first language. And I suppose you could say the snake was in the class, or the snake was in on it. So they invented this language together so that they could communicate with each other. Further on, we then hear another story as to how Adam named all the animals. Well, how does a man who recently learned to talk, and if you assume he invented the first language, how did he manage to build a vocabulary that allowed him to name all the animals in the world? Even though we know this is not possible, biogeography pretty much debunks this. How exactly would Adam give a name to glyptodons, for example, that come from South America? How would he give a name to the giant wombats that we know as diprotodons that come from Australasia? How would he give a name to camels, which we now know originated in North America? How would he give names to the early proboscideans, the order to which elephants belong? We know that there were hundreds of different species of elephantids in antiquity, and we also know that they did not live at the same time. So my point is a very quick one. It's going to be a very short one. I'm simply saying, is it actually logical to believe such a thing? One, that these people were able to communicate just like that. One, that they also named all the animals. It's impossible. You couldn't possibly name all the animals because you wouldn't be aware of all the animals. You certainly couldn't name all the dogs because we now know that dogs descended from an extinct species of grey wolves. So that's impossible. You couldn't name cows because we now understand how cows were domesticated. You couldn't name pigs because we now understand how pigs were domesticated, even though the passage says he names the wild and tame animals at the same time. So essentially, what they're trying to tell us is that wild and tame animals were created together. We know this didn't happen. We obviously know how some of our animals were domesticated. Cats, for example, domestic cats, domestic dogs, and I can go on and on and on. So the point I'm trying to make is that we can ask ourselves certain questions and say, what is likely to be true? Individuals don't invent languages, populations do. So it is highly unlikely, in my opinion, that these two people in this garden with a talking snake, I'm not even going to go into why that is just such an unlikely story. I'm actually going to speak more about original sin. I'm going to delve into the mechanisms of disease. Some of my future episodes will be about malaria and what we understand about the life cycle of malaria parasites, which actually happens to kill at least 200,000 to 300,000 children every year. And most of these children come from my country, Nigeria. Now, malaria is an obligate parasite. What do I mean when I say it's an obligate parasite? It basically means that this parasite has to infect human beings. It has no choice in the matter. In order for malaria parasites to undergo their life cycle, they have to do it inside a human host. They have actually evolved that way. And we actually have a fairly good understanding of why that is the case. But if you want to make the argument that this all happened because a talking snake hoodwinks two people into eating a fruit, well, be my guest. I am simply going to elaborate on why I actually think not only does this not make any sense, I actually think it's a pretty unhinged idea to even propose such a thing. The idea that just because two people who could not possibly know the ramifications of what they were about to do disobeyed a direct, I suppose, order from God or whatever you want to call it. And because of that, malaria parasites kills 500,000 people every year, and most of them are African children under the age of 5. I don't know how anyone can really believe such a thing. And what's even more curious is that the mosquitoes that carry malaria parasites do not suffer from it the way humans do. So I suppose you could make the argument that these malaria parasites were intelligently designed to kill humans, if you want to subscribe to the idea of intelligent design. There are innumerable ways that these parasites evade our immune system. So you would have to ask again, is this still happening because of this notion of the talking snake fooling two people? So all these things are happening because two people spoke to a snake. I don't know what you think, but for now I'm just going to deal with the language issue and why I think the story never happened. But we must scrutinize these ideologies based on the claims that they make. The story never happened. Two people couldn't have taught themselves how to speak. Two people couldn't have invented a language by themselves and then had a conversation with a snake. And strangely enough, if you actually read the passage, it actually says the snake was Satan. So if the snake was Satan, why was the Christian God punishing all snakes with the idea that they lose all their limbs and they have to eat dirt burgers for the rest of their lives? How does that even make sense? If snakes had absolutely nothing to do with it, why are you punishing snakes? Is that not a valid question to ask? And if you knew that your enemy or your sparring partner, if you like, was going to do such a thing, why leave him with your kids in the first place? So if you really look at the story, not only would you have to ask a couple of pertinent questions as to why it's virtually impossible for them to communicate with each other in the manner in which it has been described in the Christian Bible, you also have to ask yourself, why would you punish your children who couldn't possibly know that what they were doing was wrong because they had no knowledge of the good and evil before they ate from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil? Why would you punish them for listening to your enemy who really was the culprits? Because the passage does say that. Now the serpent, and then it has Satan in brackets. So clearly it wasn't actually a real serpent. None of us have ever seen snakes eat dust. I certainly haven't seen a cured McDirt burgers, if you like. So it makes no sense whatsoever that you would punish the victims. Because if you were to believe the story, then you could turn around and say, actually, humans, or the first two alleged humans, were the victims of Satan. But the Christian God allegedly punishes the victims, which are Adam and Eve, and a snake that actually didn't have anything to do with it. There are many other reasons why I think the idea of original sin is actually quite distasteful, and I am going to elaborate on that by talking about disease in later episodes. But for now, this is what I wanted to talk about tonight, and there will be other episodes where we will go into rather more clear detail about how diseases affect not just humans, but other animals on earth, and even how diseases affect other microbes. Because yes, the bacteria that make us sick, the viruses that make us sick, also have other viruses that make them sick. I suppose you could ask, what did the first bacteria do? Or what did the first virus do? Or did the first frog do? And now, because they're being decimated by a fungal infection. So I just wanted to leave something to give us food for thought about the idea of original sin and why, for me, it actually makes no sense whatsoever. Thank you very much. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you again soon.
Not like this we did. 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 Not like this we did.